Hi, I'm your host Vasco Duarte. Welcome to the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast, where we share tips and tricks from Scrum Masters around the world. Every day, we bring you inspiring answers to important questions that all Scrum Masters face day after day. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Team Tuesday. This week, we have with us from Berlin, the beautiful city of Berlin, Maximilian Dazer, also known as Max. Hey, Max, welcome back.
Hi.
So, Max, on Tuesdays, we talk about teams, but we always want to know, also in the spirit of learning, as we were talking about yesterday, what was the book that most influenced you in your career as a Scrum Master?
It's probably hard to just name one book, but one that I just read multiple times was User Story Mapping by Jeff Patton, I guess, because it just helped me to understand so many things, like how could a product backlog look like, that it doesn't need to be this list of eternity with 600 items, how user stories are actually meant to be, like not because most of the time they're just a requirement called different. So it just helped me to better understand like the agile software development and actually also to coach POs. So I can always recommend this book.
Yeah, absolutely. And that aspect that you talked about, coaching the POs, is incredibly important for us as Scrum Masters, right? I usually call the PO Scrum Master pair the dynamic duo, right? Because if these two work well together, they can make amazing things happen with the team. But when they don't work well together, it doesn't matter what team you have, it's not going to end up well. So that's a great tip. So definitely everybody out there, check out User Story Mapping by Jeff Patton. Jeff has been on the podcast, so I'll put the link to his episode as well. And I'll put the link to the User Story Mapping book also on the show notes so that you can easily find it. So Max, thank you for that recommendation. Now we turn our attention to the teams and how sometimes they become their own worst enemies. We've all seen it happen that teams, slowly start developing these patterns or behaviors that ultimately lead to problems. So tell us that story. Give us a little bit the context of the team so that we know, is it a big team, small team, multiple teams, working in a big project, small project, whatever that is. Give us that context, but then walk us through those small things that started happening that, when you look at them individually, they don't mean much, but over time, they led to this anti-pattern that ultimately destroyed the team.
So this is a story about former two teams, like one backend team, one frontend team, and they were merged together. I guess in total it were 8. I just call them developers. This would probably be 2 front-end people, 3 back-end, and the rest were manual testers. And after the merge, this is where I entered the scene. And the story goes more or less about the Scrum/Kanban board, where they visualize the work. What was kind of obvious when you looked at the board in general, how the teams work, that there were still more or less 2, or worst case, 3 teams.
How do you see that? Like, that's an interesting thing for us to learn. Like, when you look at the board, you called it the Kanban board, and some people will call it the Jira board or the Scrum board, whatever you call it. But you were looking at the board and you detected, wait, there's some things here that tells me that maybe there's even 3 teams here. What were those things?
So they had multiple boards and tried to experiment there. The first iteration was you had like to do, and then there was front-end development, then there was back-end development, then there was code review, and then there was a testing column. And in each column, there was just like 2 people responsible for this column. So for front-end development, there were just the front-end developers looking in there. Back-end development, just the back-end people. For testing, just the tester looked at this column. So you had a lot of handovers, and you could just recognize they are not collaborating. It's just a lot of handovers, and if it's in the next column, I don't care. And this led to multiple problems like sub-optimization. So when we try to get faster, whatever this means, for every person just meant to get a ticket faster out of his or her column, which doesn't solve any problem. And the bottleneck in the system, because tickets piled up, were in the tester column, which was because they were just manual testers, no automation, nothing, and they couldn't speed up to the development speed of the whole team. And this was just an issue that you could spot on the board. The problem was to get rid of that, because the team were not used to work together. So just an idea like pair programming or whatever, they didn't like it.
How, how did they say that they didn't like it? Because there's many ways in which teams kind of pair programming being an example. In that team, you already had code review, but sometimes we also hear teams saying, well, why would I want to do code review or whatever? Like, how were they pushing back on pair programming, for example?
As pair programming was like, I try to introduce it as like this kind of knowledge sharing, because I want to get rid of these silos where we just have front-end development, back-end development, and said, why don't we just work together on it? You can just have this front-end developer and the back-end developer, and you're opening, because this was Corona times, opening like a Teams, Zoom chat, whatever, and try to develop on it at the same time and collaborate on it. And in best case, even get our UX designer in there as well and talk about that stuff. So not really the on like textbook pair programming with navigator and driver, but just
working together. Yeah.
But they said, yeah, the backend people said, yeah, the front end people don't understand what we're doing. They don't care, and vice versa. So this was going around in circles, and the same was then for the manual testers, to include them there in as well, because developers said they don't want to test, and it was tricky, and everything that was part of our Scrum framework just crumbled.
So basically what you're saying is that every time you guys discussed about working a little bit more together, more collaboratively, you got a big no.
Yeah. And this was a problem, not just because there was no team, it was more of a group, but also all of our Scrum events don't make sense. Like the daily becomes boring because it's just a reporting event suddenly, where just people tell, yeah, I'm doing this, and no one else cares because they are not connected to the work. When you have a refinement session, everyone just talks about his sub project thing, so just about front end, and then they just talk about back end, and then someone says, yeah, we can test it this and this. So people just stop caring, and this was a huge problem. And it's one of the biggest things that I always try to avoid, to have like this kind of whole team approach. Yeah, like this is one of the worst anti-patterns that I can name.
And what happened to this team? Like, did they continue just working that way, and they continued not caring about working together, or what happened next?
They improved a little bit. Like one important part of this story is that these front-end and back-end developers were also part of a different company. Like that's a complex story, but
ouch,
it just makes it even harder to collaborate, because they're not in the same country, they're not even in the same company. And legally, I guess the front-end people were not even allowed to see the back-end code. I don't know why this is an issue, but so it just made it like there were just organizational impediments to work together. But we tried a little bit. So we had like knowledge sharing with the manual testers, because we figured this is an easy step, and just said, we expect you to test before you put something in code review. And then some people said, yeah, but I don't know how to test. And then we said, that's easy. We have 3 people here who know our product really well. They can give you tips. And then we just had this sharing session when something was ready to be code reviewed. They first had to pair up with a tester and make sure they tested together. So this worked a little bit, but this front and back end separation was not solvable for this organization because there were bigger issues.
One of the things that comes to mind from this story is that it's the good old Conway's law, right? It's like the separation that we make at the software architectural level creates separation within the team. And that's not always avoidable, but knowing that Conway's law tells us that the organization reflects the architecture of the software and the architecture of the software reflects the organization, we can also easily go in and start observing and analyzing. Like you saw a symptom of that when you looked at the column names in the board, right? And you saw, okay, there's a big division here. And what that also helps us is to find ways to get teams to collaborate by using Conway's law as a guide. For example, architectural changes will enable collaboration, right? If you have a very strict separation between front and back end, which architectural is not a bad idea, you also typically have a very strong separation in the developers, right? It's my stuff is front end, I'm not touching the back end. Or as I heard from a developer, I don't do servers, bro. and so on. And this gets even worse when you add to this DevOps engineers, who are also another breed within the engineering community. And they might even be working on a totally different office or even country. And they don't get much help either. And one of the things that I try to work with the teams that I work with is to bring this concept of Conway's Law to help us, right? For example, when there's a very strict separation front end, back end, we look at what if we had a slightly different architecture where at least parts of the system have a middleware layer, and that middleware layer is actually owned by both front end and back end and not separately, as an example. And that kind of forces a little bit the collaboration, and forcing in the sense that they can't work well if they don't collaborate, because they are working and owning the same code. Now, this is not always possible, of course, but that's one of the things that we can bring in. When you go into other organizations and you see this anti-pattern, Max, what do you try to put in place to kind of bridge that gap, bridge those that strict separation?
So I can do a specific example from teams I'm working currently with. There's also not as strong as I described, but there's still a separation. So there, for example, just 2 people who can release in a team of 8 people. And I just talk with them to understand if they see this as a problem. So do they want to change? And in best case, they want to change, and then we can proceed. And if they don't want to change, I wait until this problem is really there. So let's say the 2 people who can release are on vacation, and suddenly we can't release. No one knows how. And like this happened. And then people want, after that, most of the time they want to change. And what happens really quite often is that Taylorism kicks back in, and people say, yeah, but I can't have this additional skill because we don't have time. Like, we don't have time to get better. We don't have time to improve. Then you realize you need to look not on the team level, but suddenly it becomes an organizational topic that the team's kind of expected to be 100% busy. Like, there's no slack time in it. Then they just will build up technical debt. They will never be faster. And they're more or less what people call a feature factory. And then I just talk with management a lot. Like, I really annoy them to explain why the team needs slack time, why we need to invest into skill and knowledge sharing, and why we will make it get slower right now to be faster in the long run. And just try to get buy-in. Because even if the team wants to change at this point, they still are afraid that they are not allowed by management. And sometimes that's a misconception because they never talked about it. But sometimes this fear is real. So you just need to get them in a room and just try to figure out the problem. And this is the approach I use most of the time.
Yeah, absolutely. You said something there that actually is very important for Scrum Masters. Even if management hasn't said anything against them changing, if they feel that management will say, then it becomes a reality, right? It's even if the reason for the fear isn't real, the fear is real, and we need to work with that. It was a great story. Thank you for sharing that, Max.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Tuesday is Team Day here on the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast. But tomorrow we talk about something that goes beyond the work we do with the teams. We will talk about how to lead change and what our guests have learned from leading and participating in change programs during their career. See you tomorrow. We really hope you liked our show. And if you did, why not rate this podcast on Stitcher or iTunes? Share this podcast and let other Scrum Masters know about this valuable resource for their work. Remember that sharing is caring.